Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this episode of Real Talk, Real Trust with dotCMS. I'm your host, Ryan Pacchini. This is the second episode of our series. The title is Building a World-Class Brand in the Age of AI. I'm joined by two very special guests. One you may be familiar with, who was on our first episode, Zane, our CEO, and Eric, who is the CMO of CallMiner. Guys, before we get started today, why don't we do just a quick introduction? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll dive in. So, Eric, why don't we start with you, and Zane will go over to you.
Sure thing. And I'm glad to be here. Looking forward to having a conversation. So I'm currently the CMO at CallMiner. CallMiner is the global leader in conversation intelligence, which, to put it in human speak, is essentially our platform uses AI to analyze 100% of all customer interactions and uses that analysis to give agents, customer service agents, guidance, and then also bubble up all the insights that are needed to improve a company, essentially, especially the CX side of things. Before that, was working with you, Ryan, at Acquia, which is a global leader in DXP, essentially the open source counterpunch to Adobe's, Adobe Experience Manager offering. And before that, I was on the ad agency side, working on B2C and B2B brands.
Awesome. Eric, thank you for being with us. Special to have you here with us today. Zane, and a quick intro on your side. Obviously, CEO, don't need much of an intro, but whatever you'd like to share would be great.
I'm dotCMS, your host. We are a content management software, much like Acquia, as you mentioned, Eric. We're also open source roots, been around for more than 17 odd years. I am new to this space, fairly new. It's been 3 years. Before that, I spent almost 12 years in the world of finance, doing investment banking in different parts of the world, Asia, Europe, North America. I eventually ended up launching my own fund, which acquired dotCMS. So kind of in the financial industry, making my way into B2B software and this exciting space.
Thank you, Zane, for being with us as well. So before we get into building a brand and get your thoughts on how brands are being created, how they're evolving in the age of AI, we started our last episode with some rapid fire. The fun thing about rapid fire is you cannot answer in more than, I think, 2 words, 3 words, but there's no sentences, there's no explanation in rapid fire. Okay. And I'm going to alternate between you, Eric, and you, Zane.
We should have prepped this.
I know that's why it's rapid fire. Reach, or frequency, Eric?
Frequency.
Zane, reach or frequency? Frequency says. Zane, this time, do you first win their heart or win their mind?
Win their heart.
Eric?
I know we're supposed to disagree on some things, but heart, 100%.
Demand or PR?
That's a tough one.
Start with you. Eric, we'll start with you on this one.
So that's a tough one because, in B2B, PR is basically one of your biggest brand levers. So I'm going to say PR since this is a brand discussion. But at the same time, I also know that any CMO in B2B, that's too many words. Shoot, sorry, dude.
No, Eric, you broke the rule, but we got your answer and the great clarity. Next one, I'm keeping you on the hook for a short answer. That. Zane, to you, demand or PR?
Demand, just because Eric said PR.
Also because you're a CEO and you're supposed to say.
I've got two rule breakers on this call. You guys are both being held accountable for this last one. Zane, I'm going to start with you. Consistent engagement or occasional deep conversation?
Depends, but a consistent engagement, I guess.
Okay. Eric, how about you?
We're talking about brand consistent.
Love it. Guys, thanks for having a little bit of fun with me to kick things off. And the rapid fire was intentionally meant to make you squirm a little bit, and also for our audience to see that there are trade-offs that we have to think through, and they're not easy trade-offs. But maybe we'll get to the topic at hand here, which is building a brand in the age of AI. I think, Eric, for someone like you who has a deep expertise in consumer brands, which is typically where we think about how the brands that we know or come to the front of our mind, and even now being on the B2B side of things, maybe you can tell us how you think about brand broadly and how you define brand.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I think there's a lot of similarities. There's definitely differences between B2C and B2B in terms of the practice of branding. But at the end of the day, one of the things I think I just accidentally call it serendipity, benefited from being more B2C before I joined the B2B side is you end up learning a lot more of the fundamentals about how brands are built, thinking about consumers as opposed to the B2B side, which gets a lot more formulaic, I think. So I do think what gets lost on the B2B side a lot is the emotion aspect of building a brand and some of the core fundamentals. I think about our time at Acquia, and when we first started thinking about campaigns, most of the team had no idea how to write a brief, to be the North Star for a particular campaign. So even just some of those fundamentals that happen in every single campaign on a B2C side, I think are the things that translate nicely into improving how you think about injecting brand into everything on the B2B side. But that's just my thoughts is essentially, if you have got sound fundamentals, it doesn't really matter whether it's B2B or.
Yeah, that's great, Eric. Yeah, thanks. I love the emotional part of that. And that's essentially what you're trying to strike in many cases when you think about brand, is that connection, which starts with the emotion and the logic. And so, Zane, as you talk to a lot of our customers since acquiring dotCMS, content is often the conduit to brand. Why do the organizations that we talk to, from your vantage point, think brand is so important?
I'm really glad, Ryan, you chose this topic, because my kind of venturing into the brand is fairly recent. I've been reading a lot about how to build a company from point A to point B, and the more I kind of read, sort of so-called experts in SaaS, they say 10 million ARR is the mark when you should start thinking and investing in brand. And as you know, we crossed that 2 years ago. So I've been thinking about this a lot. The way I think about brand is basically the total experience that your company delivers to everybody that you kind of cross paths with. And that is, your customers, obviously, and that is the customer experience, but also your messaging, your visuals. And then, Eric, you mentioned the emotional response. And the way I think about it is that all of this experience should evoke an emotional response, and that should be trust, so that you can build a long-term relationship with your customers, audience, and what have you. So, yeah, I mean, for me, that trust is fundamental to everything that you do in delivering these total experiences to customers. Content for me is one element of it. Obviously, consistency is important, authenticity is important, all those things. But it should also kind of be based on your core pillars of values that your company stands on.
Yeah. So the only thing I would sort of slightly disagree with on waiting to 10 million for starting to invest in brand, perhaps yes, on some of the brand, let's say, media spend or specific content. But I think going back to my fundamentals comment, regardless of whether you've even hired a VP of marketing or something, if you're Series A, you should be figuring out those core values and your mission and your vision and some of the core things that go into the brand fundamentals. I think those should stand the test of time, whether you're 4 million or 10 million. And then you can start to really invest in essentially amplifying those through some of the things you were talking about.
You guys have talked about a lot of different things that I think tie into brand and that also tie to the C-suite, right? Like, Zane, you talked about this idea of every interaction and what that experience is like, right? Eric, you've talked about the North Star and values and how important those are in terms of building a company. And those are brand things. But when you walk into the C-suite, Eric, because you've done this many times, you said, we need to invest in brand. Like, some of those things are conceptual, right? They're philosophical. They're not tactical and concrete. So when you go into the C-suite and say, hey, we need to invest in brand, how do you convince the CEO, the board to think about brand and all the things that go into it and the dollars that you want to invest in it?
Well, first, I think it should be clear that, especially when you're thinking about demand, when you're thinking about B2B, pretty much everything should have brand injected within it. So I think you could be spending, every dollar you spend in demand gen, if you're doing it properly, it's still conveying your core brand messaging. You don't have to think about it as a completely separate investment just in brand. I do think to your point about having conversations with, in particular, the CEO and the CFO, I think what you have to try and do for both of them is assess quickly how much do they believe in brand? Because you're going to have a variety of different, I think, levels of savvy in terms of whether the CEO came from a company before your company where he or she truly understood that the value of brand equity is massive in terms of acquisition and retention, et cetera. So I think assessing that quickly as a marketing leader is key. And then once you've figured out their level of savvy, just have a conversation with them. Some of the things that I found works, depending on where they are on that spectrum, is share with them some other brands that are B2B as well as B2C and show them how the value of that brand helped them with acquiring new customers, but also retaining them. That's going to help him mentally connect the dots to the bottom line. So I think having those conversations just then opens the door to align on some expectations about how much you're going to spend on things that are heavier on brand, meaning they're indirectly hitting pipeline versus the demand gen events, et cetera, that you have direct line of sight to pipeline.
Yeah, Eric, I love that. And I'll speak from my personal experience, which is to kind of reiterate one of the things that you talked about, especially talking to the CFO. Sometimes if you can capture an example of why your competition can justify it and win a premium price point against you in the current market, there's no feature gaps. The selling motion is relatively the same, right? And then you can see that they're getting 30-40% margin or price point above yours. That is a good conversation to be able to have with the CFO and help them understand that there is something in this equation that's not tangible per se, it's intangible, and that there's an investment that needs to be made in the intangible in order to close that financial gap. So I've seen that happen a few times, but that identifying their level of savviness as it to investing in brand, I think is a great first point. Once you've kind of had that initial conversation and they say, okay, I'm willing to invest in brand. The next question is often, how are we going to measure the impact of brand? Maybe I'll start with you on that question, Eric.
Certainly. And, we were talking about B2C brands, versus B2B brands. I actually think this is an area where B2B brands could teach B2C brands a thing or two. And having been on the ad agency side earlier in my career, I can tell you that for a lot of the B2C brands that are spending, that have the money or the, to spend on a big ad agency and a media spend, it becomes very disconnected to the actual bottom line of, is this actually delivering dollars? Is this acquiring customers, helping me retain? It's up here in sort of the ether and it's not connected. Whereas in B2B, you have to prove some sort of connection, whether it's direct or indirect, to that bottom line. So I do think that there's some learnings there. I think there's a variety of things you can do with your CFO to show the value of brand. I think there's a lot of leading indicators that I tend to look at that help you understand whether you're looking at branded keywords and the increase or decrease of seeing a velocity of those. I think you can look at the volume and the tenor of the G2 reviews. Obviously, an increase in mentions and share of voice, although that's kind of volatile. But those are the things that I tend to look at that help to quantify some of the return on investments that you make that are brand focused.
Yeah, I love that, because if I simplified that a little bit in terms of, how a relationship was built 50 years ago, it was the number of times that they showed up at your store, the number of times that they called, the number of times you shook hands with them. And that you just have a new blueprint for that, which is mentions, which is in views. And so it still is going back to trust based on engagement. That is what everyone knows intuitively is going to help drive the relationship forward, right? So
I think you can always use the typical brand study approach, which is surveys, whether that's CSATs or NPS. And I think every company should do that at some degree of frequency. One completely non-metric thing that I think you should do is to help your CEO and CFO understand the need for investing some degree in brand is partner up with your sales, your CRO. And I can promise you, if you're talking to the field and you're talking to your salespeople, they will tell you when they have these interactions whether these prospects have ever heard of you or not. And typically they're using their gut, but a CEO is going to listen to a CRO. So if you guys can go into this together, I think that's going to be very beneficial to some of the things you want to do.
Yeah. When the salesperson walks in the room, are people leaned in? They excited because they have a good feeling about the company and they believe that they have value, or is it a cold room essentially is the
Exactly.
metric. Zane, anything you wanted to add here in terms of maybe what you are holding the marketing team at dotCMS accountable for when it comes to building brand, or just conversations you've had with clients around the impact of brand?
The one thing that I would maybe throw in is a little bit of a metric, but the sales cycle length.
Yeah.
And if you look at the sales cycle from the funnel perspective, top funnel, medium funnel, bottom funnel, I feel like if you have a brand, and if we assume that at the foundation of the brand is the trust that we talked about, then your audience or your customers, for us, these are large enterprises, financial services, healthcare, a lot of compliance and security concerns. I feel like they would reach out to you faster before they complete 90% of the research and wait until they're sure because they don't want to waste their time. So that's your top of the funnel. I think you will see people reaching out faster. And on the bottom half of the funnel, I feel like your due diligence time would also, decrease because your brand already represents that trust that if it doesn't exist, then and we see that, right? When we started 2 or 3 years ago, our sales cycle lengths were so long because these large enterprises were really doing deep diligence on dotCMS. And we have been seeing that shrink over time as we have been obviously, building more trust in the marketplace.
So you mentioned something really important, I think, since we're having a brand discussion about the buyer's journey and all the activity that happens before a prospect even reaches out and engages with you. So there's a whole bunch of studies out there that essentially says like over 60% of the decision making even has happened because they've been doing self-serve research and everything else. And they essentially have already figured out their consideration set of which competitors that they're going to choose. They've even figured out possibly and when I say they, I mean the buying committee, who the favorite is. So the ability to impact that brand awareness by investing in it properly, I think is key to all those things.
Yeah.
Just going back quickly, Ryan, is again, I think investing in brand it's not a cost, right? And I put my CEO hat on and I put my CFO hat on. I do wear both of those hats. From a CEO perspective, I feel like brand is your differentiation, what the story you're telling, right? That's essential. And as a CFO, it is going to drive revenue, right? It is going to decrease your customer acquisition costs, however you want to approach that problem.
Definitely.
So 100%.
Yeah, I think maybe just one other idea that came to mind as you think about having this conversation around measuring the impact of brand and having that conversation with the C-suite is if there's implicit trust, a premium can be charged and there's a lower cost of sale. And I think about it for me, I'm going to really humanize it here. Both of you guys know that I love Air Jordan 1s. That's like one of my favorite things in the world. And the reason that I buy them is because the premium that's associated with the brand, which is Jordan, and the cost of goods is very low because I don't even have to try them on anymore. There's implicit trust. I've had many pairs, so it's a little bit of a silly analogy, but I think how do you humanize that for a CFO or a CEO about the things that they buy without friction with the premium and the investment in brand? So I know we're down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but Eric, it sounds like
That's
you want to
fine. I
chime
mean,
in
I
on
think
that.
honestly, you're pointing out your examples, kind of pointing out something that I think marketers fall into a trap when they think of brand. They think of messaging and positioning and like ads and content that we put out there. But ultimately, the true definition of brand is what your customers perceive it to be, and what influences that is everything. The customer service agent they talk to because your Air Jordans didn't show up on time, the product itself. So all of it, when we talk about that North Star and some of those core foundational things that I think you should invest in before 10 million, I think all of those, all of it being huge impact on, you, Ryan, having such a positive, I guess, a positive perception of Air Jordans.
Oh,
So in the example.
absolutely. Absolutely. And most of us don't have an icon to stand on for their brand. So that is a bit of an outlier. So let's maybe transition to the folks who don't and the steps to build a world-class brand, right? So we've alluded to some of them, but maybe we get pretty prescriptive here. And Eric, maybe I'll start with you specifically around what are the key steps to building a brand? If there are any that you haven't kind of mentioned, or even if you might want to go through them systematically.
Sure. Well, I mean, to be clear, we both live in the tech world. So I do think, before you start thinking of brand and some of the things that are start informing that, you still need to have a very clear product market fit. You need to figure out like, what is your product offering? What problems does it solve? Because I think that's the starting point for you to start figuring out some of the brand fundamentals. Your brand fundamentals, really, this sounds cliche, but some of the first ones you want to start with, because they're both internal facing and external, are mission, vision, your values. I think you start with some of those, and then you start getting into some of the, you can take your vision and your mission and start getting into thinking about your value proposition statement, which has to be both what your promise is, but also what your differentiating point is. Like, what's your unique selling proposition? Why are you different than the other three options out there? Or why are you different than the industry you're trying to disrupt? Beyond that, and it's a bit of a framework, you get into like 2 or 3 of the pillars that support that statement. So what proves this ambitious statement that you said is your value proposition statement? So that framework ends up being your fundamentals. And then from that point, once you've nailed that down, I don't even start thinking about visual identity until after you've nailed all those things down. Like, messaging and visual identity comes after you figured out that first framework.
Yeah, Eric, that's great because that drives the consistency in a brand, right? Like once you have those things down, then everyone is grounded and rooted on those, the visual identity, the channels, the tactics, how the team is structured. But I think that's, having a single source of truth and then to be able to deploy that single source of truth to all parts of the organization. And then especially it gets even more complicated when you have multiple brands, you have regional markets, you have languages that needs to get, needs to translate through. So I think
It ends up
that's,
being, if you've got a house of brands approach, then you still have the thing at the top of all those, that is your North Star for all of them, but almost you have a framework for each one of those brands and the sub brand.
Yep.
But I think a lot of times values gets either just sped past and you go like teamwork and you come up with like really cliche ones, but don't sleep on values, because that actually becomes a lot of the things internally that motivate and provide, a clear understanding of what your brand is about to your employees, to everybody from the intern to the sales guy to the marketing person. Like, those are the things, if you write really good ones and they resonate with who your brand identity is, I think that's how you can do this well.
yeah, that's awesome. Eric, I have a bunch of questions of the layers underneath. I'm going to hold on them for a second because I do think one of the things that folks will care about is how AI is impacting those things. Because obviously, if you have, especially in the age of generative AI content, if you have this North Star, these values, this differentiation, and then you have the ability and these powerful tools to then go create content that's meant to layer up, but you're using a machine to do that, there's going to be some form of disruption. And so, Zane, I guess maybe I'll kick it to you because we're thinking a lot about AI right now. How do you think AI from our lens is going to impact how brands are built moving forward?
The next step to what Eric just alluded to is to, once you have your values, differentiation, as I guess pillars of the messaging that you want to build on top of, then the challenge is then to produce creative, consistent content at scale. That's the challenge. And I think from our perspective, the way we think about it is obviously content management system is where your content lives. That's where, our users create content. So we are thinking about it from integrating AI in literally every workflow where users can, create personalized content at scale. And obviously it ties back to personalization also. And I guess personalization has also been a challenge, and maybe I'm jumping ahead talking about personalization, but again, it's a scale problem, right? How do you create clear, consistent, creative content at scale? And that is the personalization problem, because you want all these different variety or variations of content for every persona based on their local context. So I would say that's, for me, is the biggest change or influence that AI will have. And then the second would be just more data, right? Insights, deep insights on this local context of the customer. We talked about that people buy on emotions, right? And I think I was reading something along these lines where people have different buying behavior based on the weather, right? If it's raining or if it's sunny or it's Hurricane Helene or Milton, they're gonna have different buying preferences. So all that data can be brought into this equation where you can create that level of content, at scale for personalization.
Yeah, Zane, as a marketer myself and in previous roles, as I'm hearing you say that, there's like this weird mix of emotions between being really excited about like this idea of the content that you're creating that is personalized, actually getting down to the regional market or to a specific persona. There's also this fear that I'm experiencing around how difficult it is to automate that while holding to the promises of the brand, and skepticism of like, how can people actually do this at scale, like with the right permissions, the right workflow, the data flowing both ways. And so I think it's, as we think about like the steps that you need to take, right, to create that content at scale, I'll pass it to both. You guys can jump in. What are some of the best practices that organizations should think about when it comes to using AI to create content at scale?
I think regardless of whether it's content or pretty much anything, I think the key, and you guys have said workflows a few times. So regardless, I think that's your key thing you need to think about is, so you think about all the different, workflows that you have that ultimately lead to content, that lead to the creation of additional pages on the website, whatever else it is. So those are all individual workflows. So find the spot in those workflows where you have a lot of mundane tasks on one front that can be sort of automated and done by an AI agent of some sort, or look for areas where it's a bunch of repetitive tasks that you currently have humans doing, and you can essentially get an AI to do all that. So I think, specifically around content, a couple areas of the workflow, if you think about, let's say you have a small B2B marketing team, 2 people on your content team, there's a particular capacity what 2 people can actually create in terms of blog posts, white papers, everything else. I'll give you an example. One of the hardest parts of writing great quality content is the blank page. So utilizing, ChatGPT or whoever it is to get that V1, and do not ever publish V1, please, whoever's listening to this, but using that just to get past the blank page, if you've given it enough of a good prompt, and even try out a couple different LLMs out there, but that is huge. And that's something that has helped our content team quite a bit. The other thing you can do is, even just helping it generate a variety of content ideas that you can then put into your content roadmap. So just things like that on the planning aspect of that content workflow, I think are huge in terms of a small B2B marketing team.
Awesome. That was great. Great. Thanks, Eric. Zane, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think from a workflows perspective, the way we are thinking about it, obviously, probably not directly brand related, but at least from a marketeer's perspective, just automating some kind of repetitive tasks like content modeling in your CMS, taxonomies, search. I mean that those are the things that for us will definitely boost productivity, along with all the content creation stuff that we've talked about.
I'll riff on that, just one other part of that, because I'm thinking about content now, and I'm thinking about one of the other things that I think AI is quite helpful with is on the analytics side of it. So, we obviously have access as marketers to a variety of different analytics. Most of the times it's disparate, but if you think about one of the key things that informs your content strategy, it is organic search activity. And, what types of searches, how are people searching for all the things that are relevant to your company? So being able to take that as the knowledge base that you feed into some sort of GPT to give you, like, tell me, what are the top 5 things that we should be talking about right now based on what people are looking for? Those types of things would usually take a human, tons of time with a ton of error to give you that simple answer. So I think things like that allow you to spend way more time on figuring out what high quality content you guys are going to even create.
Yeah, Eric, you brought up this idea of like relevant topics, right? That might be future looking, that might not even be on your radar or something that's critical. How do you balance brand consistency and the core things that you want to talk about, maybe some of the permutations or real-time stuff, and safety of the brand in this age of AI? Because you have so many things that you can do, but keeping that consistency as well as sort of the safety around the brand that you want to balance. So maybe just your thoughts on how you'd approach it.
Sure. Well, first, just in terms of just to close out the book on content, one of the things, regardless of how well you're utilizing AI in that workflow to be able to create, tons of content, I still think content still comes down to quality over quantity. I still would definitely recommend you only publish one blog post a week if you have to, if it's just really good. And it's going to give you value, both SEO wise, everything else, over 50 blog posts that are just, the same thing that all of your competitors are saying with no differentiation. So that's one part. But in terms of thinking about how to approach AI and Gen AI with, I think hearty appetite, but also some risk mitigation, I think the biggest thing, depending on what industry you're in, let's say you're in finance or healthcare, then you've got a lot of compliance and risk you need to worry about. So I would say you need to definitely go into this with that in mind about where you are, those workflows you're applying AI to. You're probably never going to allow, an autonomous chatbot to just be out there on your site with no guardrails whatsoever, to give you just a non-content example. But so there's that, just being really cognizant of what level of risk you're willing to go after. The second part would be, be very focused and don't try to do 50 different things with AI. Pick one or two things and then QA the hell out of that and make sure that you're not releasing anything into production without actually having gone through it and testing it to make sure it's ready. And then you're monitoring it for a while. Then once you've got some successes there, you can go after 3 or 4 other projects, but don't try to do 50 things at once.
Yeah, I love that. And Zane, I know that's been a big part of our approach to AI. Maybe you can talk through how we're thinking about maybe key use cases around where we think AI has an immediate impact, because there's all kinds of tools from, content creation that gets deployed into code for a variety of pages, how generative AI is used for image generation alongside content that's been created. But maybe you can just ground us on 2 or 3 use cases where we think it's going to have a huge impact for content as a conduit to build trust.
I guess the main pillars, again, are authenticity, consistency, and compliance or security or data privacy. So within those 3, if you talk about from that lens, I guess from an authenticity perspective, the key is to not over automate, as Eric said. I mean, it's absolutely necessary to have the human touch, and if you can enable the users, within a consolidated system, there's going to be absolutely more controls versus people using disparate sources and then bringing them together on a Google Sheet and then copying it and pasting it in the CMS and then publish. So obviously it matters if content is generated within a unified system. So the system knows what's going on, and the system can highlight the risk, and it can go through a separate workflow and have maybe more scrutiny, supported by also technology where you can also kind of enable or facilitate that process. And same goes for consistency. I think we're still slightly early on that, but we are looking at, how, I guess, train your local model within your content management system on your tone of voice and on your visual identity and whatnot, so that you don't, to Eric's point, I think the blank page problem is the toughest. But if you can still bring your tone of voice and your brand within that first draft, I think that could be huge. And again, we do feel that CMS is probably the best place for all of that to come together. And on the third aspect of it is compliance, and I mentioned workflows earlier. I think we can definitely assist in making sure that there's more scrutiny on AI generated content.
One thing that's I think helpful that what we're seeing in our industry, and I'm going to give you a bit of a framework or a spectrum to think about, but it's ultimately comes down to control. But right now we're a little bit in the Wild West. So when it comes to compliance and governance, when it comes to AI, especially privacy, security, and what you're saying is all these companies are, like AI committees, or they're hiring ahead of AI to help figure this out. Ultimately, it comes down to a bit of a framework. If you think of on one side, it's completely human only. To the other side, it's completely autonomous, AI agent of some sort. But in the middle, you've got varying degrees of human in the loop. When you think about the different ways you're going to apply AI to a particular workflow, you can choose from that spectrum and choose based on the risk and control you're trying to accomplish, depending on what your level of risk is. So I think thinking about it that way is the best way to do it, especially until your company has published some sort of formal AI governance policy that you've got to adhere to.
No, I agree. I think what was that, Air Canada, where the
Got it.
AI where AI what was it, promised? I don't know.
Yeah, basically the story on that one is that one was actually not even an AI bot, but essentially their bot made up a policy about bereavement flights or whatever they're called. And it basically told this individual who was smart enough to screen capture it that, of course, we'll refund 100% of your flight cost or whatever. And that wasn't their policy, apparently. So it all went to court. And of course, Air Canada did not win that one.
Yeah, no, I was the only reason I bring it up, Eric, is to your point that for your customer-facing chatbot, you probably need a lot more guardrails
Yes.
than an internal system, for example. So
We're actually launching our first AI BDR as a chatbot sometime in the next couple of weeks. So we are, what I said earlier, we are QAing the hell out of it right now, but also we've been very clear about the guardrails of what it can and can't answer. Like if this type of question comes up, you need to throw up the calendar basically, because we're not going to allow you, chatbot, to answer this one.
yeah, book a demo, 100%. What is your inclusion policy? Probably not.
Yes.
Well, I think it's really interesting you guys are talking about, because this reminds me of the rise of social platforms on two fronts, which was it was brand new space for brands because it was one of the first two-way communication channels. And it was initially thought of as something that was going to transform all customer engagement and how you build a brand. I mean, there were CPG brands that scratched their website and put up their Facebook page, and then all of a sudden 6 months later they were rebuilding their website. And so I think one of the biggest things for us is the core pillars of building a brand to build trust, the core value of content and how you utilize content. Some of those things are going to remain. How do you augment? How do you make sure that you're not getting caught on the next shiny thing as it comes to AI? And you look at some of the age-old challenges and how it can drastically improve it. And then gradually look at the things that are kind of transformative or brand new in terms of how they would impact content as a conduit to build trust. So
yeah, the social thing, that's a good reference. And you were probably like 10 years old, Ryan, when that happened. But I was in the middle of it and working on a bunch of B2C brands. And what I can tell you is it's very similar, completely different situation in terms of risk mitigation. But none of these consumer brands, Pizza Hut, none of them knew what to do with Facebook and Twitter and everything else at the time. They had no policies, but it's very similar because if you're familiar with like the Gartner hype cycle, essentially it goes from like FOMO and everybody's just throwing everything against the wall to like, then you get down to this pit of despair because you're like, oh my God, this is actually pretty scary, risky. So our chief product officer for our annual event just recently referenced that that Gartner hype cycle and asked whatever GPT it was, like, where are we in the Gartner hype cycle with Gen AI? And essentially it said we're in the pit of despair. Like we've gone from FOMO to like, oh gosh, we need to figure this out essentially. So it's definitely a good reference, Ryan.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I think that's hopefully what some of our listeners have captured today is how some of the things that are tried and true can be mapped in conjunction with this new opportunity with generative AI, with the end goal of building deeper customer relationships. Maybe I'll start to move towards our closing and a few additional questions I have to leave our listeners with some final thoughts. Maybe Eric, I'll start with you. Where do you think in the next 6 to 12 months that AI is going to provide the most value in building a brand? We've talked about a lot of different things, but
Sure.
maybe just a few
I
things that
think,
you land on.
continuing with the idea of pinpointing the right use cases and workflows within those, the thematic we've been talking about. I think essentially marketers, whether they're B2B or B2C, are going to get smarter about which ones, they want to make their bets on. We've done a bunch. We do an annual survey. Obviously, this is for B2B, but as you might expect, like 60 or 70% of the respondents are all investing in AI. But then there's another 40% of those aren't exactly sure which AI to pursue and what to do with it. So it's a little bit of like, we know we need to do something, but so there's a lot of enthusiasm around it. And I would just go back to being very strategic about which things you're going to try out. Don't try to boil the ocean. Just go after 2 or 3 things. As far as where I can see it having an immediate impact, obviously content, like we were talking about, I think for a marketer is the most obvious one. But if we go back to the origin of our conversation, which was around brand, marketers tend to forget that there's 40,000 other touch points that impact how a person perceives your brand. So don't forget about customer service and chatbots that are helping there and what's informing how those things interact with customers. So I think, while that may not be the CMO's responsibility, I think if you have that strong North Star and you're having good communication with I guess it would be the COO, then you can make sure that you're not sleeping on all those other touch points that aren't marketing.
Yeah, Eric, I think that's great because especially as AI enables the whole buyer journey to be automated, there's not much of a difference in a consumer's mind between what the content that they see on the site versus the content that gets pulled through a chat bot versus content that might be automated to them through an app, right? It's about the experience that they have. And all those things go back into building a brand. So a holistic view on how AI and marketing are impacting the buyer journey, which is essentially the brand, like we talked about in the beginning. So thanks for sharing that. Zane, any thoughts on your side around where we think AI is going to bring the most value for creating brands here in the next 6 to 12 months?
I think of it two, I guess, main pillars. One is
Yep.
your hyper personalization at scale. And that obviously has one building block as content creation at scale. But for that, you need to have those guardrails. You cannot produce content at scale unless you can ensure your brand consistency, compliance, and authenticity, all the 3 things that we talked about. We've obviously talked at length about it. The second thing that I think about is let's call it A/B testing at scale, which really means that loop between the test message and the data of the local context of your audience, and then just having that on very kind of rapid iterations. I think that's probably the easier one than the first one, because first one has all these other layers. And obviously one of the things that we are also building is the content analytics, just so that we can increase the frequency of this test cycle. Yeah, that's how I
Zane,
think about it.
I love those too because the A/B testing is something that has always been challenging to create the versions of content and the volume of content for it to be meaningful. So even though those types of tools are out there, AI should be a force factor in order for that to really come to fruition. And then content analytics to me is another really interesting one, which we've had a lot of conversations about internally, especially because where is generative AI content going to land and then where it gets engagement? It's the value prop and the messaging clearly needs to come from a human. The product documentation or the product specs, depending on your B2B, can come from AI if they're being updated or changed. It's that middle layer of content, which is what's going to resonate with the consumer. They feel like it's AI generated. Are they going to be turned off? Are they going to be okay with it? What level of human touch is needed? I think that's going to be a really interesting topic to watch as organizations are trying to build their brands for the futures.
One other one I think would be interesting to think about, because it's not one that we can directly control like we can in terms of, picking the right workflows and the right level of human assisted or completely autonomous AI, is what's going to end up happening with how people search for things. So you're already seeing it. Anybody who's gone and Googled something, instead of clicking on the results, you're getting most of your answers already delivered, and they're pretty accurate, and you end up not clicking on anything. So I'm not just talking about the SEO aspect of it, but what knowledge base is that tapping into to even answer the question? So whether you're going to Google or a web, let's see what OpenAI does with their play in this. But I think you're going to see a lot of people trying to figure out how, what knowledge bases, what licenses are they paying for to get access to teach that bot to be able to answer those questions? And how do I gain that system to actually help my brand versus it being completely out of my control? So that's an area that I'm curious to see what happens, but also selfishly, I want to know what happens sooner than most so that we can get ahead of it, because I'm a little bit worried about that too.
Yeah, Eric, that's a super interesting one because it's about discovery, right? Both discovery of who you are as an organization and discovery to get the information they need to go deeper in the buying cycle. And that's been pretty linear for a long time in terms of how search happens, and it's about to get turned upside down as well, from my opinion. But with that, I just want to thank both of you. Eric, very special to have you on. Amazing guest for today. Zane, as always, a pleasure. Thanks for sharing both of your thoughts. And to our listeners, we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Real Talk, Real Trust. Until then, be well. So long.